Hello everyone, and welcome back to another art history lecture. So, big life update. For some reason, I have 60,000 subscribers on here. And I'm not just saying this is still something incredibly baffling to me. The fact that real people in real life watch these videos through and through. And although it's definitely motivated me in so many positive ways, like, I'm definitely reading a lot more, and I'm obviously putting a lot more detail and incorporating a lot more introspection when I'm making these videos. At the end of the day, I really am, I'm just doing these for fun. I mentioned this a lot in my more earlier videos. Please don't watch those. Those are, like, I'm not very proud of them. But, I talk a lot about how I started this channel as a digital archive, and kind of this ongoing personal project for me to read more and teach myself. And myself learn more about art and have like a digital ongoing record of it. As this channel has somewhat, like accumulated, it's made me think a lot about the ways it has been able to connect me more recently, whether that be through the arts or people, like friends that I've made on campus or even professionally. Very reflective of the way the internet is great in this way that it's so good for instantaneity and what it means to hold convenience through being able to access the instantaneous. And I think this idea of being instantaneous is also something that I honestly value a lot, because something very critical about myself, about the way I conduct myself, that's something I've been reflecting upon a lot recently also, is the way I socialize has been incredibly influenced by the internet. And I'm someone where I can very safely self-label myself as someone who has grown up chronically online. I think I self-taught myself a lot from online spaces. Tumblr obviously was a huge one for me. Through Tumblr, I taught myself, I learned aesthetics. I learned like how to present myself. I learned how to break up with my boyfriend for the first time in middle school. How I learned socialization in the first place and making friends. If you're going to a different city and you want to meet more people or you want to reach out, it's very reflective of the ways that I learned to socialize myself from a very early age through like online chat rooms or like various online multiplayer games. Because when I tell you I played Animal Jam, I fucking played Animal Jam. I played Animal Jam for 9 years of my life. And I was so dedicated to that game. When I tell you I was involved, if obviously you know what I'm talking about if you play this game, I had every possible rare or beta item that you could possibly have wanted within the game. Honestly, side note, I think the game in itself has impacted so much of my literary interest now, especially in the sense that although it's obviously its primary function is to be a socializing game for young children, the basis of socialization within the game is literally on trading. And the baseline barter system of the game, of like these rules of trading commodities with these rankings of rare, beta, or common, literally created its own micro bubble of an economy like socialized through 12-year-olds. Like it's so interesting that these 12-year-olds have this idea of material scarcity within their own socialization game. But anyways, I think it's really interesting to me how this term has even emerged, like what it means to quote be online, and how this idea of being online has completely extended far beyond the literal meaning of the physical temporary action of using the web. It does not equate to someone being online. I guess to be considered someone who's online, you don't even necessarily have to be creating or producing or publicly contributing online, but being online, I think it's interesting because it rather denotes this idea that this action of being active online, of interacting in the online interface, it denotes this idea that it's continuous, or it has been continuous up until now for you, and for a significant amount of time been interacting or consuming with the online interface community to a point where it literally has shaped your cultural attitude and perspective on things, can earn you the label of someone who is quote-unquote online. And just your presence, even if it's passive, even if you're just looking at other people's contents, I think this idea of it is something becoming incredibly relevant now, with kind of with everything going on regarding technology and AI, we see that even your passive presence is something that can be repackaged into granular data. There's definitely this very strange inversion happening of a sorts where the usefulness of individuals to firms isn't really, it's not based on your own contributions as a consumer anymore, or like posting or having like a visible sense of production as a consumer, but rather what is useful to these forms under digital and platform capitalism is just this ambient emission of information that is derived from you just being passively consuming. Because like through your, if you are online and you are someone who constantly consumes online, through your mindless online consumption, you are basically in the process of being captured and cornering yourself into this very curated individual space that you think you have created yourself. But no, it's something that the system has created to sell back to you. And I'm sorry, I feel like that was a little bit heavy for an introduction. I feel like that escalated very quickly, but I did want to show you the tea I'm drinking. Very nice golden oolong. I've been really liking my oolongs a lot recently. I feel like it feels very fall. So now, obviously, if you realize that just the mere act of being online is something that inadvertently contributes to the digital economy, you kind of have to think about then what exactly can be free without a cost in a world where even everything passive gets harvested into a commodity. So actually, for historical context, note, I know I'm going to be going through this so quickly and I'm missing so many gaps, so I know a lot more people online are, I'm sure, way more well-researched on the technicalities and details of it. But just for very brief context, the internet actually began as an experimental network in the late 1960s, and was developed by researchers and government funding, originally for the military industry complex to facilitate open communication and information sharing for better communication for US troops during the Cold War. This culture of wanting to collaborate, wanting to keep things open is what essentially laid the groundwork for these online programming communities that really valued this idea of creating shared knowledge. And for instance, the Homebrew Computer Club was an early computer hobbyist club that was developed in Menlo Park, California from March 1975 to December 1986. And this club and organization is something that had such a huge influential role in the development of the micro-computer revolution in Silicon Valley. Some very prominent members of the club include Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs of Apple Computer. And these homebrewers in Silicon Valley, they called themselves the homebrew movement because they met and shared advice on building personal computer devices from a very scratchy, like, do-it-yourself fashion, very similar to the process of homebrewing beer. Because if you think about it, beer and alcohol, like the idea of fermenting alcohol, is something that has historically been around for so long, and it's been brewed domestically for basically as soon as man arose. Wanting to produce it at home has been altered by legal structures surrounding regulating alcohol. And the reason that craft brewing or like homebrewing is even a thing is because at certain points in time, the legal structures that people lived under banned or restricted the production of it. So that was really interesting that so much of like programming language and culture has like this linguistic metaphor of beer. Another really prominent figure, Richard Stallman, in the 80s was this huge key advocate for software freedom. And starting at MIT with the GNU project, Stallman emphasized the grand idea of kind of the foundation of the open source movement, that software should grant users the liberty to be able to study and modify and redistribute code. He had this very, very famous statement in which he says, free software is like free speech, not free beer. Because in English, there are homonyms to the word free, which often leads to confusion because people mistake open source for just hobby projects or just something completely free in cost. But free software, when Stallman and these other programmers are referring to it as being free, it means that this is software that respects users' freedom and community, not literally the fact that it's lacking economic price. Like for Mac OS and Linux is literally, it's named Homebrew. And it installs and manages software based on a command line literally called formulae and bottles, which are the pre-built binaries, I guess, made for like faster setup within the system. So when they say not free as in beer, they're obviously the core freedoms that define like free software is the freedom to run the program as you wish, the freedom to change it and suiting to your personal needs as a programmer, and the freedom to redistribute the copies to other people. And although Stallman used this metaphor of beer to distinguish these two homonyms within the meaning of the word free, I thought it was really interesting because there was actually this movement. I read about this movement called Superflux within this book. It's very constitutive of a lot of eco-critical perspectives in art, which was really cool, but it focuses a lot on this movement started by the Superflux in 1993, and one of the projects, I'm gonna list like a PDF link of actually all the projects that they worked on because I think what they did and are doing are super cool. But this collective in 1993 took this beyond code and kind of enmeshed the binary of what it means to be free beer as opposed to free software. And they literally, this project literally applied the principles of the open source movement to beer. And their project literally called Free Beer was actually the world's first open source beer. And what they did is they released it with a recipe and branding under the Creative Commons license, and it essentially allowed anyone to modify and brew and share the recipe freely. Inspired by the same ethos behind free software, even beyond just the beer part, after Superflex launched their open source beer recipe, they actually set up another project, an extension of it called Copy Shop, where people could actually buy modified originals or improved copies of political anti-brands. Like, they would produce high tops that look super similar to Converse, but their alternatives were not made in a sweatshop, or this idea of Mecha Cola, which was an off-brand of Coca-Cola, except the profits made from this Coca-Cola sold by Superflex was like 20% of its profits were distributed back to Palestinian charities. And Superflex in itself has become like its own legal case study because what they've done is just very radical in the sense of what it means to be producing as a counterculture. And this common underlying theme of what it means to own what you create is very interesting to me, as it's like the baseline foundation for the open source programming movement and like artists in general for what it means for them to own their own means of production. And this common theme specifically in software, like this idea of the free exchange of software, has actually led some to compare it specifically to the gift economy. Historical Marcel Mauss's potlatch ceremony in which someone gives very extravagant gifts or even sacrifices their own personal goods to elevate their own social prestige. However, this is something I disagree with because I think, specifically in the context of open source and homebrew, for a programmer to sacrifice or give away a program that they have written, greater the number of people that take from it or copy it does not necessarily make the inventor of the program poorer or less off as it might with material, like actual physical material goods. And even if the takers do take and use a program or don't even contribute it or like add an extension to it, it does not cost the overall greater community anything, the fact that other people are just taking or freeloading from it. And this is why Stallman and a lot of other people find it such a big issue of this idea of firms and larger corporations trying to privatize information, because to charge for it as though if it were a material good that runs in scarcity or that it can be taken from someone, and to hedge it with the same exact restrictions that govern material commodities, is just so counterproductive. It makes absolutely no sense. Obviously, I'm hoping a lot of people agree with in terms of accessibility to sharing knowledge and trying to share what you know. But I think while this generosity of code that really underlines programming culture and like people actually very passionate about contributing to the development of software, I don't think the culture that surrounds it is quite as radical as it first appears. In fact, I kind of now want to segue into this idea that what is so radical in nature about open source in the tech world actually fits very comfortably with a neo-libertarian vision of the meritocracy relationship between individuals and institutions. Because why, like, I'm thinking about this online phenomenon of people online, specifically people who exist and actively post on platforms like X, where very public-facing online media discourse usually tends to take place. Like, why do they hate San Francisco so much? Most of these people haven't even been to San Francisco or have seen it for themselves. And it's not the city in itself that they despise. It's more so they hate the tech elite class that has dominated and transformed it into something immutable for their own. And the very horrible reputation San Francisco gets because of these people, of these tech workers, is because so many people in Silicon Valley are constantly parroting this myth that technology is this neutral force for good, that innovation in itself as a concept will solve social problems if only the free market is allowed in reign and there's no regulation around it.
You do?
Look both ways.
Oh, yeah, I did.
I'm growth at Agentic Drone. Previously product at Drone Agentic.
Oh, I see. So you just switched roles within the same company.
Oh, no. Agentic Drone is an agentic workflow within the drone itself. So one system was in charge of infra to figure out which children are in the room and what color they are. And then another system would talk to... But Drone Agentic questions, should the agentic workflow live within inside the drone, or should drones be the agentic workflow? So one drone would tell the other... Exactly. And I really like startups that kind of question the status quo. And I'm curious, do you think feudalism is good or bad?
Like,
I'm growth, by the way. Everything growth.
Yeah, how about we talk about that? What is growth?
Yeah, so I just woke up and I was like, I am product. And I am product. And I'm everything product. It's time to grow. So that's when I made the hard switch to Drone Agentic, which really challenged.
And it's so interesting that they parade themselves to be like these radical social changers when the fact that these people, the tech elite, thrive is precisely because they embody this neoliberal market ethos of relentless self-optimization and this constant, like, godlike faith in the unregulated market. Very interestingly, thinkers like Eric Raymond claim that open source software, such as Linux, the fact that it was still produced under free market conditions in which selfish agents are allowed to maximize their own utility and produce, like, its own self-correcting order, is still operative and conducive to the same liberal system that is used to maximize productivity. Their altruism masks this quite larger self-interested pursuit of prestige within their own techno-elite community. A really great book that I also finished reading recently was States of Injury by Wendy Brown. It's just a collection of her essays. A really great essay she talks about is like this idea of the ideology of neoliberalism and how it permeates into the individual identity. I mean, Marx's literal exact argument, like the problem he had with the utopian socialist, was that the problem of dominion in capitalist relations can't be solved at the level of distribution, no matter how egalitarian the distribution might seem. And this is something that's really, like, entrenched into this idea, I think, of the tech elite, of, like, the tech worker class mindset, that they can't grasp this. They genuinely see technology as, like, this ultimate resolution to society's problems. And I'm going to try to navigate talking about this without sounding like a Luddite. It's just so interesting that this idea of free software, this movement of open source and accessibility is so entrenched in the tech class, is really aligned with this neoliberal promise of this very hyper-individualized form of freedom. It's also very interesting to me because another, like, very large point of, like, media critique or something to poke fun at of these, like, tech people I've noticed is their seeming lack of, like, taste. And this can be a whole other video about what it means to have taste. I'm not exactly sure what this correlation is, this lack of aesthetic judgment and wanting to use technology to solve everything. I don't know. But what's really interesting to me is a lot of these people who are coding, who are creating code and programs, view their work as art. They literally argue it as art, the fact that they are producing something based on their own volition, that they are creating parallel to identifying themselves as like this disruptive, creative innovator who essentially is an artist producing work. Now this is when I bring in this book that I also finished. This is a really good book. I actually really like this one. Internet Art, The Online Clash of Culture and Commerce by Stahlbrass. And he starts off by saying he wrote this book because he wanted an actual tangible product, a physical text about the web that couldn't be read or skimmed through in a very hurried manner that usually online web texts or articles usually are. And one of the most important things he notes in this book is that the internet, even though this book is about people who have used the internet for creative means, the internet itself is not a medium. It's not like painting, it's not like print, it's not like video. The internet is a transmission system for data. Technically what it is it is an agent of modernization in new media, like what is understood to be new media. The content of the work and the interface are completely separated. Like the way you view it and the work in itself are two separate things. So I guess net art, like work in new media, can be understood as like a construction of an interface to the database, but in itself it is not a medium. It is not the entire cohesive medium. Within this book, I also wanted to bring up Shulgin's www art metal project from 1995 to 97. And I think this is a very particularly intriguing early form of internet art, because in this project, pre-existing websites are linked together on a single page where Shulgin awards them virtual medals solely based on their artistic appeal. The artist then draws links, like hyperlinks, between these sites and presents them as the singular framed, like, collective artwork. And he says about this own work, quote, "All of the documents on www are potentially linkable. They belong to the same horizontal surface of material, singularized objects on which artists and designers can draw." I think in this very particularly peculiar, very early form of internet art, that links pre-existing data in a very singular manner as if it were a result of a single user search query is in itself, it can be considered an act of appropriation, just like in the manner of Duchamp, because there's no signing or dating of these objects. It's just a gesture of pointing out what exists online. And I think it really reflects Duchamp's infamous statement that ready-mades, the whole point of ready-mades, the idea of what is considered Duchampian, is the fact that it reflects a total absence of good or bad taste. And I think the emergence and movement of net art in particular definitely was conducive to the economic shifts from the Thatcher Revolution in the UK, because obviously her entire like government structure was around this content for high culture and this huge withdrawal of like state arts funding during the 1980s. And I think it really catalyzed a point and shift in the art world, especially in the UK, where high culture institutions started to kind of struggle for the first time, while on the other hand, very savvy, like media aware and radically generative British youth, like the creative British youth generation, really gravitated towards the arts and community arts. A really specific example of this is Keith Bunting's very early online net pieces. And I see it as a very, very strong characterization between online to like try as an attempt to refute technological determinism. His Project X 1996, is described as graffiti street internet interface. And in this project, he used chalk to repeatedly tag the streets of Bristol and London, the URL for his irrational.org website. And these chalk tags directed people to Bunting's personal website, which kind of served as a gallery. I think it's very significant because by tagging using chalk, which is a very easily removable substance, which isn't what is normally typically used with what is considered graffiti, it still invited viewers to pause and engage with the digital space by potentially stopping wherever they were in the environment, looking at the irrational.org website tag, and then taking their own time to look it up in their personal time beyond it. However, his work started gaining a lot of publicity and a lot of popular attention, and this kind of led to you know, obviously, inevitably in the scheme of things, larger institutions and brands and arts magazines reaching out to him, like Wired magazine is something he accepted and worked with, and he was offered these paid positions at a lot of arts institutions. And he claimed, even though he accepted these things, that he himself would never be implicated in the culture that he criticized with net art. But actually he, upon kind of him blowing up and being famous, very well-known media theorist Timothy Druckery. Like, literally, I remember when I read this out loud, I was like, damn. Because he wrote, Bunting is best known among the digerati for his intended subversive actions and attacks on corporate and consumer culture. Bunting's naive stance revealed his ignorance of the hard lessons learned 20 years ago by less inexcusably innocent precursors. Had he been paying attention, he could have learned sooner that there is no outside to corporate culture, or more importantly, that outside is just another target market. I think this critique was so important and so especially pointed because the standard rhetoric of the online technophile is rebellion. It's disruption. It's radicality and innovation. And this image of being outside, like being an outsider of these established structures. The state and capitalist art institutions often find legitimization by incorporating artworks that kind of appear to oppose them and subvert them, take it for themselves, and then put it onto themselves as a way of subversion and being able to control what is said about them. And I think it points out to this very much stronger idea that the tension between subversion and assimilation reveals this very core contradiction at the heart of net art and digital culture, that no matter the radicality of its intention, the fact that it still emerges from digital capitalism means that its practices that seek to expand freedom or disrupt corporate domination still can be absorbed and repurposed as sort of the logic of the system in itself, which is obviously a much larger harder question to answer directly, but I think a good quote to sum it up from media theorist Richard Barbrick. Very simply put, but very pithy, capitalism cannot be criticized from within capitalism. And I'm just going to touch on this very briefly because it's kind of inevitable. But, you know, this is very conducive to the emergence of NFTs. The idea of making something so uniform of appearance of art on the web, something that is so interchangeable in visual nature and pattern, I think it really proves that one Walter Benjamin essay, I forget the name of it, he wrote a lot of essays, but the specific one, I'll find it later when I edit, where he talks about how the unique experience of the work of art tied to a very particular space and context and time totally withers away with the mechanical dissemination of the image of the art itself. And in the context of NFTs and the financial and the technophile financial class that has this long-standing weird argument that, yes, it is art. Art is freed from its material weight when art is treated as a token in a cultural game and just as an agent of shuffling of these new novel combinations of symbols and art and value is like just something that is so obviously antithetical to the nature of creative production. That is like also going back to what I was saying, like these people seem to not be able to understand, like they have no sensibility of it. But this idea of ownership within art I want to return to, and I want to go back to the initial group I referenced before, Superflex, because another project that they worked on was Free Soluit, and I think it's another project that really embodies what seems to be this very intrinsic philosophical desire within us, which is this unrestricted dissemination of knowledge and ideas. And if you didn't know, brief context, Soluit was a very, very prominent artist in the minimalist conceptual art department, and what he did is he revolutionized art, specifically through like these structural wall drawings and like modular like sculptures. So he would always have this set of very specific recipe, this instruction manual for being able to replicate it, for being able to recreate the line drawing anywhere. So like as long as you followed the instructions of the environment, of how you draw it on the space, of what you do to draw it on the space, what he was saying is technically no matter who is the one drawing it, as long as you follow the instructions and you produce it correctly as per according to his instruction, then you have created it in itself. However, recently the people who own his estate and his foundation have gotten really weird about copyright and idea of what it means to own it, and there are a lot of regulations surrounding who it is that actually draws it to be able to be identified as Soluit piece or like within a museum. Like it's just become very legally complicated upon his death. So I guess that's why Superflex started this movement called Free Soluit, in which it totally extends upon this original logic of Lewitt's work of physically replicating Lewitt's untitled wall structure without the permit of his estate and foundation, and distributing these replicas to anyone who wants them free of charge. And within this era of Soluit, I think another really interesting book that touches on this idea of net art and reproducibility and dissemination of culture and knowledge. This is a really great book. I'm actually not finished with it yet. I'm still in the process of it. It's Boris Groys. I think I've mentioned one of his books in a previous video once. I forget which one. But this one is In the Flow. And in this one, he says, quote, "During the 19th century, there was a tendency to present life as a deviation from a certain program, as a difference between living body and a machine. However, as the machine paradigm was assimilated, the contemporary human being was increasingly seen as animal acting as a machine, an industrial machine or a computer. If we accept the Foucault perspective, the living human body, human animality, does indeed manifest itself through deviation from the program, through error and unpredictability. This is why contemporary art often tends to thematize deviation and error, everything that breaks from the norm and disturbs the established social program. Philosophically, it's so important when you're viewing digital art purely as a creative expression to make sure you are analyzing it under the context that it still is a social artifact that is shaped by the logic of the platform and the governance of the algorithm. Because internet art is not only visualized to represent modernity, but in itself, internet art is a form of modernization and this ongoing agent participating and contributing to like global consumer culture that is inevitably shaped by surveillance and data. I'm fully aware this is so ironic. I'm making this video totally critiquing the idea of online production when this in itself is an online production. The fact that my internet presence online, that I'm publishing my face to be a form of this creative process in itself, an affirmation of this system. I think what is important to recognize is that as myself, an online consumer and producer myself, it's very important that we are looking towards new forms of like a data ownership regime to mitigate this one-sided appropriation of our data and our collective creative consciousness from these tech firms. Even though it's a lot more engaging for me to make these, I think as the topics get a little bit more relevant to the present culture and are just incorporating so many more readings, my endings are getting more and more undefined and open-ended because unfortunately these problems that I'm bringing up and I'm trying to address do not have a direct resolution that I can be able to verbally like pronounce to you within a YouTube video essay. But I think the best way to conclude upon this is just thinking about it in this way. Like, for these technophiles of libertarian right, the direction of like the networked mechanical order of the internet, of AI, of technological progress, when it is unimpeded, when it is unrestricted by any form of mediation or regulation, whether that be from individuals or the state, it will reach, they see it as reaching this amazing height of instantaneous satisfied desire. But I think even here, at this point, I think art can really act as some sort of healing against this very dangerously destabilizing effect of runaway technology, which is what net art in a way kind of embodied. And I think it's a parallel pendulum in a way. I think as technologies are advancing so rapidly, like neurologically, this in turn is obviously going to rapidly change our perspective and our view of art in itself. Rather, it will cause people to think even more critically about the procedures and mechanisms within themselves that are responding to a certain piece of work or what it means for them to create a certain piece of work. But as I say at the end of every video, thank you so much for watching, if you made it this far, and as I continue to make these and I am internally mitigating what it means to put myself online as well. It's something that I'm trying to think a lot more about. It's very important to read, take time to read, take time to be offline. Obviously that should be unspoken and unsaid, but in this age of constant gratification, of constant convenience, of the constant convenience of being able to see online and be a consumer online, I hope the person or the people watching this are very aware of the time that they choose for themselves and what it means to value time for yourself. So I guess with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I will also be taking time for myself and reading, and I hope to see you in my next art history lecture.